you all for joining us today. For those who don't know me, I'm Daniel Glyn-Jones from Odgers Berndtson. I lead the digital governance capability for the technology practice, which sits at the intersection of data privacy, forensics, and cybersecurity. It's my absolute privilege to work with such an outstanding expert panel to explore the question of generative AI, friend or foe. From there, I'd like to open up with the first of the questions to the panel. Obviously, the full Q&A will come. But to get us started, one of the questions around where we are up to on this journey is, this is one for the panel, what scale of generative AI adoption and usage are you seeing? Could you lead us in with that, Mike?
I think, lots of what I say will be kind of skewed in that kind of cybersecurity domain. So I think, have that in mind when I speak. Everywhere is thinking about generative AI, right? I cannot stress how much security teams are thinking about it. It's being put in their face. It's kind of, it's the next step to kind of making all of this digital data kind of make sense and glue together. There's still lots and lots of kind of questions to be answered around just some of the risks that Ray obviously raised, are just very present in that kind of cybersecurity data in terms of hallucinations. Is it going to give you the right information? And most certainly, I think for CISOs, it's the privacy element. What data is going to be transmitted back into those learning algorithms, into those models. I would say, our operation is global, so this element of generative AI being in that cybersecurity domain is in America, it's in Europe, it's in the Middle East, and it's in our Asian operation as well. So I don't think there's anywhere that we're operating today where there isn't very strong interest in it. Now, in terms of adoption and actually building generative AI into a kind of core component and operationalizing it, I would say there's not many people at all that I've seen that have done that. But if you go to a conference and you add generative AI onto your kind of talk, it really does make a huge difference. I was at Gartner kind of a few weeks ago in London, and just adding generative AI on was pretty impressive.
Does anyone have anything to add to that? Has anyone experienced anything different or additive to that?
Yeah, maybe if I can add a perspective here, Daniel. I think Mike's right that there's a lot of on vogue discussion around generative AI. The key piece that we're finding in discussions, as we help to develop the new ISO standard for AI at the moment, which is ISO 42001, which should be published later this year, is that there are a lot more people using AI than we think there is. And this has been backed up by recent survey work that BSI has done. Many organizations are still officially saying they're not using generative AI, but their staff already are. And there's a real decision point that organizations really need to make here as to whether to embrace the complexity and recognize that generative AI is here to stay, and not be afraid of it, to actually use it, put some guardrails around it, but to accept that their staff are going to use it. Or do they just sort of maybe remain blinkered? Because there's plenty of discussion already in the professional services world and the research and analytics world that people are doing work a lot quicker now. And how are they managing to do that? Well, the open discussion is that they're going home. That they're not allowed to use the likes of ChatGPT tools on their work computers, but if they're working from home, they can use it on their home PC and very quickly derive the insights and the outputs that make them look very efficient at work. So the real challenge for organizations is, do they stick their head in the sand and say, actually, we don't know enough about this yet to actually operationalize it, as Mike said? Or do they actually embrace it and be willing to learn, be willing to get a few things wrong, be willing to accept that there will be some failures along the road? But unless they learn from those failures, will they actually then understand the true benefits that can be derived longer term from generative AI?
I think the point Mark makes is brilliant there about how much the organisations really understand how AI is being used across the workforce. In my space, in the communications world, it is being applied in a number of ways for generating content, whether it's verbal content or imagery for content distribution. We're seeing clients use it for thinking about scenarios and how they plan workflow, etc. And in my old world, in government, it's being applied in some quite interesting ways. The Royal Navy, for example, using generative AI as a part of the interface in their recruitment marketing, and that some really interesting things about the extent to which people will raise questions with the AI that they wouldn't with a human being. Like, is it okay to be Muslim in the Royal Navy? Is a question that's come up in that context. So really interesting applications, and in the comms world, in sort of journalism, of course, in media, it's being Gen AI is already being investigated and applied in some interesting ways around data, aggregating news, dealing with historical content, and obviously there's this question about future content. But Mark's point about actually how much organisations really know where it's being applied, I think is hugely telling. Some of the surveys, BCG did a really interesting piece. 53% of senior executives saying we don't fully understand Gen AI and are actively discouraging its use across our organisation. But we know it is being applied by people in organisations who are doing a lot of the work. And actually, Mike's organisation, Darktrace, had this wonderful stat about 74% of active customer deployments having employees using Gen AI tools in the workplace, irrespective of the policy, if you like. So I think the challenge that Mark put down there about how the organisations put in place a policy that makes sense as this technology evolves hugely rapidly, and as the way people use it evolves, to sort of shape that, but without constraining it, I think is a really interesting question.
Mark certainly has been spending a bit of time in industry talking to some of the big players in Silicon Valley on that side. Mark, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're discovering in some of those conversations?
I think this touches on some of the aspects that Ray mentioned as well. And, today is headline news in Milton Keynes that, we have the Global AI Safety Summit taking place. AI is here to stay. But the points that Ray made earlier around the difference around generative AI, the really telling point for me was the open letter signed by Elon Musk and thousands of technology leaders earlier this year, because this for the first time was almost the technology industry demonstrating a conscience, saying we know that AI has been here to for a long time, but it's going now at a pace that society is not comfortable with. And if we look at some of the recent BSI surveys, over 10,000 people surveyed, and 62% of people were saying they expect their industries to be using AI every day by 2030. Yet 66% of people just simply don't know enough about it to trust it. And I think that was well encapsulated by the Elon Musk open letter that was signed by Steve, lots of tech leaders, Steve Cook, et cetera. That for once, the tech industry has said, before we go too far, before we lose society, before it's only seen as a foe, let's take a checkpoint. Let's actually work out where we want it to go. Let's work out what is friend and what is foe. And for me, that's a really telling point. Over the past few years, the tech industry has become heavily regulated. Legislation has stepped in to fill a void and a gap where many organizations were struggling in areas like cybersecurity, like privacy. And because it was often seen simply as a compliance topic or a cost center, rather than a business strategic enabler and an accelerator to business and competitive advantage, areas such as cybersecurity and privacy were treated as mundane cost centers. And because of those business attitudes, governments, either at the UK, the US, or the EU level, stepped in and said, well, if you're not going to do it from a self-regulation perspective, we are going to mandate a compliance object. And around AI, actually, they're trying to stop that. what the open letter was really focused at was to say, give us some time. Let us work as a community to actually establish where the guardrails should be. We accept there are some high-risk areas, such as medical devices, such as autonomous vehicles, such as robotic and industrial manufacturing, which may need specific regulation around the implementation and use of AI. But when we're looking at the wider aspects of AI, putting a pause into the system, saying, give us some time to work out what the standards of acceptance should be, what those guardrails are. And we only need to look earlier this week with President Biden's executive order around the safe use of AI. It's going down that pathway. It's actually saying, what is safe use? Where should we establish the guardrails? And then once we've built that solid foundation, let's work together, as we've seen with the likes of the Atlantic Declaration, to actually move that forward and say, this is how, unilaterally from a UK, a US, a bilateral, a trilateral perspective, the economies and ecosystems can work together. So for me, it's a really positive step that the tech industry have demonstrated a conscience to actually say, let's get this right before it runs away from us.
Thanks, Mark. And Ray, I'm sure you'll have something to add to that, given some of the policy conversations you've talked about in the US and more broadly.
So yes, I mean, I broadly speaking, I guess agree with Mark. I think that it's not realistic to expect there to be a pause, but I don't actually think the authors of that paper expected everyone to down tools and to take a pause. I think as Mark was implying, it was more of a statement of intent and rallying people together. I think that there is a reasonably broad consensus that regulation of some type is needed and that self-regulation probably isn't enough. I've been, at the AI Fringe Monday and Tuesday, and I think that was coming through very clearly. And I think we will see that. And as Mark pointed out, the executive order from President Biden is very wide-ranging, actually. Because of the challenges of getting things through Congress, et cetera, it may be a little limited in how it gets applied, but there's certainly a strong intent there. And I think that, BSI and the standards organizations of the world, though, have a really important place to play in this, because it's probably unrealistic to expect regulation to be completely coordinated globally. Different areas of the world will have different regulations, but if we can at least get common standards across the world, it will make life so much easier for companies to know what it is they're going to be measured against. It allows you then to have independent checks or independent audits, etc., against a commonly agreed standard. So for me, that is one of the big areas where we really need to push, and fantastic work by the standards bodies, but also companies that put in a lot of time and effort to contribute to that process, because it's a long, painstaking process, as I'm sure Mark will attest.